Our next speaker is Dr. Eyal Kalanthroff, who will be speaking on proactive task control and obsessive compulsivism.
Hi. Okay, so as Jonathan said, I'll be talking about task control and some implications for OCD today. Okay, so I'm going to start with what is task control. First, the general definition. So task control is based on the idea that stimuli can evoke the performance of a task that has a strong association with those stimuli. For example, when we see an object, any object, we don't only see the size, shape, or color of that object, we also see what we can do with that object, the effortlessness, the behavior or task that we can do with that specific object. Now, if that, what we call stimulus-driven behavior, is not congruent or is not the same with our goal-directed behavior, with the behavior that we actually want to do or need to do, then we have a conflict to which we call task conflict. And of course, to manage or to solve this conflict, we need a specific control mechanism to which we call task control, which is a proactive control mechanism that allows efficient task selection processes, mainly by inhibiting the irrelevant stimulus-driven behavior. Okay, so one test that we use to study task control in the lab is the Stroop test, and I know you're all familiar with the test, so very, very briefly, we ask participants to name the color of the ink and ignore the meaning of the word, and we have three conditions: the congruent, neutral, and incongruent condition, as you can see here. Importantly, we only use meaningless letter string as neutral. We never use neutral words for reasons you will understand in a second. So the effects we usually find in the Stroop test are the interference effect, longer reaction time for incongruent compared to neutral, and the facilitation effect, which is much smaller and more fragile, faster reaction time for congruent compared to neutral. So the interesting thing about the Stroop test is that there are actually two rather than just one conflict in the Stroop test. So the first conflict is the conflict we always talk about, is what we call the information conflict. Should I respond green or red? And this is an example. And the second conflict is the task conflict. What is my relevant task? Should I read or should I name the color? And in incongruent trials like this one, we have both conflicts, making it basically impossible to differentiate between them. But in congruent trials, we only have one conflict, not two. We only have the task conflict. Should I read the word or should I name the color? The information is, of course, the same. So I'll skip this for a second. Just one brief comment. One previous finding is that the anterior cingulate cortex, a brain area that is strongly associated with conflict, is activated in Stroop congruent trials, not only in Stroop incongruent trials, which is another indication or another support for the fact that there is a conflict in Stroop congruent trials as well. Okay, so what we've been doing, so what we've been doing in the past year or past couple of years is we've been developing a computational modeling for task control in the Stroop test, but not only in the Stroop test, as you will see in a second. And unfortunately, I won't have the time to present the models and all the different parts of the model, but the basic idea of this model is that we have a conflict between our goal-directed behavior and the stimulus-driven behavior, and this conflict can affect response. So until we can solve this conflict, as you can see here, we're not able to execute a response. So this is the basic idea of this conflict, of this model. And as you can see here, PC represents proactive control. So the proactive control mechanism keeps constant amplification to the relevant task unit. So this is how we solve these conflicts. If we in any way find a way to eliminate or to cancel proactive control, we'll end up with longer reaction time for congruent trials because we'll need more time to solve or to manage task conflict, with no effect on neutral trials. So the final results will be smaller facilitation or actually even reverse facilitations in some cases. I'll give you just one example for this effect. So Harvest Day is about what we've been doing in the past year. So the main thing I've been doing in the past year is I've been creating this computational model simulation to see if our model can account for previous, current, and even future studies. So this is the previous study. And what we did here is we combined, this is just one example, of course. What we did here is we combined the Stroop test with the NBEC test. The important thing, or the only thing that actually matters here, is that we had two conditions, the low working memory condition and the high working memory condition. So this was our way to manipulate cognitive load. So I talked before about canceling or reducing the effect of proactive control. One way of doing exactly that is increasing the overall load on the cognitive system, so the proactive control will be less effective. What you see here is our results and model prediction. So the bars represents the results. So as you can see, in the high working memory load, when proactive control is reduced, we see a reverse facilitation effect and increased interference. In the low working memory load, you see the regular Stroop effect, facilitation interference. More importantly, what you can see is our model predicts these results pretty nicely. The model fits are pretty nice. And on the right-hand side, what you see is, so this is the mean RT, of course. The right-hand side is the standard deviation of the same experiment. So what we can say, and this is actually pretty consistent and pretty interesting, we did not look at this data. In this paper, we won't see this data or this figure or this analysis about the standard deviation, but only after we built the model, we saw that the model is actually predicting that if you reduce or cancel proactive control, you will see larger standard deviation in congruent and incongruent trials. And of course, if the proactive control is working just fine as it's supposed to be, then you won't see any differences. And this is exactly what happened. So this is analysis we did only after we had the model predictions. And it's consistent between throughout all our experiments. Okay, so a second task that we use, and here I will give the example of OCD, and Jonathan already presented the disorder. A second task that we use to study task control in the lab is the object interference task. This is a very, very simple task. We ask participants just to name the color of either an object or an abstract form. And the objects that we use here are objects that, it's not the blue banana or blue oranges task. We don't have incongruent condition here. So basically, there is no information conflict. Seeing a jacket or a shoe in red or blue does not create any information conflict. It's perfectly reasonable. But in a series of interesting, very interesting study, I won't be able to review the literature here, of course, but you'll have to trust me. These are very good studies. Wido Lahey and his colleagues show that the object interference effect, meaning longer reaction time for object compared to abstract form, is because of task conflict that is triggered by the object. So basically, these objects trigger stimulus-driven behavior. It could be any behavior that is triggered by this object, but the one task that all objects trigger is the naming the object task. So this is a vocal task. So by seeing a jacket or a shoe, the stimulus-driven behavior or the stimulus-driven task is just naming the object. So this is the competing task. And of course, the relevant task is, again, naming the color. Interestingly, though, they found the object interference effect only in children up to the age of 7. And this is very interesting. And their explanation was that after the age of 7, the cognitive system is fully developed. So the conflict is still there. You still need control, but you won't be able to see any indication in reaction times because the conflict is managed very, very quickly. So we administered the task to adults. So the data here is taken from adults. We had 30 patients diagnosed with OCD, 26 patients diagnosed with general anxiety, and 35 healthy controls. And as you can see here, we found the object interference effect in adults with OCD, but only in adults with OCD. And I'll just say that the general differences in RT that you see here are A, not significant, and B, even when we controlled for these differences, we still got the same effect. So it's not an artifact of general reaction time. And the most interesting finding of this study was that we found a correlation, a very nice correlation between the object interference effect and the OCI, which is a measure for symptom severity in OCD. And what we're doing now is, this is an ongoing research. Now we're checking to see if the object interference effect can actually be a biomarker, or if it can predict treatment outcome in OCD patients. So this is, as I said, an ongoing study. So far we have 16 patients who completed the study. So I won't present the results here, but I can tell you that the results are very exciting so far. Okay, that's it. So to summarize, tasks can be evoked automatically. Proactive task control is necessary in different tasks, for example, the Stroop task. And OCD patients display a deficit in task control, which seems to be clinically significant. And that's it. Thank you for choosing this presentation as the relevant task.